In this video, we'll create a website using HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap 4. So before we get started, I want to thank all you guys for the likes on the video that I put out last week where I set a lifetime goal of 1,000 likes, and if you can do the same for this video, I would really appreciate it. This video is the second of 3 videos deriving from the Advanced Bootstrap theme course that I just put out on Udemy, which I'll link to in the video description. Last week we did the original theme with the full screen landing page. In this video, we'll do the image slider version. Then next week we'll cap off the Nuno theme design with the video landing page, which I'm excited to share with you. Alright, so let's take a look at the theme here that we're going to lay out, and as you can see, the design is going to be similar to last week where we had the landing page at the top of the screen. Here we have the full screen image slider, and then as we work down the website, we're going to have some different elements from the Udemy course that I put out, including the portfolio section and the team section. So if you participated in building the website in the last video and you just want to add certain elements to your website from this video, you can go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's get a rundown of the website, starting with the logo up to the top left. Then we have our navigation on the right. And when we click on one of the navigation links, it's going to send us to a different section of the page, and the link will stay highlighted to tell us which section of the website we're covering. Then on top of the landing page, we have these headings along with the Get Started button, which will send us to the next section of the page. And here on the sides of the image slider, we have our previous and next buttons, which we can use to go to the different slides, as well as the indicator buttons at the bottom there, which we could also use to navigate the image slides. So later in the video, I'm going to show you how to add those, of course, and you can do away with the previous and next buttons or the indicator buttons that you see right here if you want to. Okay, so moving on to the next section, we have a section that I'm just going to call course. And this is a little self-promotion, but you can use it to your own agenda with the heading, the paragraph text, and then the button that you can see right there. And underneath that, we have the portfolio section. So as you can see, when we hover over different portfolio images, they'll zoom in. And then if we go ahead and click on one of the portfolio images, it'll open up in a new tab displaying the full image. Okay, so let's move on down through the page to the next section where we have a paragraph and then the button, followed by this Meet the Team section, which will feature Bootstrap cards with the image and then the heading and text box underneath it, which we'll learn about later on, followed by the footer section at the bottom with the social media buttons that I'm going to show you how you can customize and add your own icons here. Alright, so let's move back up to the top of the website here and size it down to take a look at the responsiveness and the mobile view. So once we get to 768 pixels, it's going to shift into the mobile version with the drop-down menu, as you can see here. And with the drop-down menu, the links are still going to reflect which section of the website we're on. And moving down the page, you'll see that the 3-column section, for example, with the portfolio has turned into a single column, as well as the cards section from the Meet the Team part of the website down here. It's going to go from the 2 columns to the single column section, and the footer will size down from being centered on the page to taking up the full width. Okay, so let's size the website back up, and I want to show you what we'll need to get started to participate with the tutorial. So in the description of the video will be the starter files for the website that you'll need to get started. So you can go ahead and pause the video for a moment if you want to download those. And then once you do, I'm going to open up index.html and style.css in my text editor, which I'm using the free program Sublime Text for. Another good one is Visual Studio Code, and then I'm going to have index.html open in Google Chrome as we're building the website. So once we go into Sublime Text and open up index.html, you'll see that we have a little bit of content already included for us. And as you can see here in Google Chrome, The content that's included will be the course section of the website, so I can include a little bit of self-promotion with the starter file download. You'll also see that there's some CSS already laid out for us for that course section. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to comment this section out so we don't see it, and then once we get down to this part of the website, I'll just enable it again so we can have that already filled out for us to save us some time. So let's go over what's already included for us here, starting at the top of index.html with our doc type HTML, and then we have our actual HTML tag spanning the entire document with the language English there included with the tag, and then inside of our head section to tell the browser how we want the website to display, we have our character set at the standard UTF-8 with device width initial scale 1 for mobile devices. Then we have the title of our website that appears at the top of the web browser inside of the tab there. That's also going to be the largest text that appears if you were to do a Google search for a website. And then moving down underneath the title tag, we have the first style sheet link, which will link us to bootstrap.min.css. So that's going to be inside of the Bootstrap folder here, and then the CSS folder. And then, as I said, it's bootstrap.min.css, which is this file right here. Then the next style sheet that we'll link to will be the actual style.css file, which is right here in the root directory. And we also have that open in Sublime Text already. Then we have the CSS file fixed.css. So what that's going to do is that's going to set some corrections to the Bootstrap framework. For example, overflow. Sometimes you get sort of a little gutter that appears off to the side of the website, so that will make sure that that doesn't happen. Now let's drop down to the body section of the website where we're linking to our source or script source files. So we're going to start that off with the actual jQuery file where we have js/jQuery, and this is the latest version with 3.3.1, and that's in this folder right here. And then underneath that we have a link to bootstrap.min.js. So we'll go back into the compiled Bootstrap folder here, and then we have the JS folder, and then we have bootstrap min.js right here. And that's all that we'll cover inside of the starter files for now. Later on in the video, we'll cover the images folder as we reference the different images while we build the website. Then the last script source file right here is to Font Awesome. And with Font Awesome, as you can see, since I put this website together, it's already updated. So that's why we're going to link to it externally. It's because they update it really frequently. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to 5.6.1 rather than 5.50. And we're all up to date with our Font Awesome icon link. Okay, so let's go back over to the finished version of the website and take a look at the first thing that we're going to lay out in index.html, and that's going to be something called Bootstrap Scrollspy. So you might already be familiar with it, but Bootstrap Scrollspy lets us light up the navigation links per section of the website that we're scrolling over or that we're navigating inside of the browser. So as you can see, when we get down to the course section or the portfolio section, the navigation links are going to be highlighted to reflect that part of the website. So to add Bootstrap Scrollspy, we're going to add something called data-spy to the body tag for the website, and we're going to say data spy equals scroll, and then we'll need to add the ID that we're going to give the navigation to link it to the body with data target, and that ID is going to be Navbar responsive with a capital R. Okay, so once we've added that, we'll add the first ID that we're going to be linking to for Bootstrap Scrollspy, which will be the home ID. So let's create an invisible comment saying that this is the start of the home section, which will span the length of the full screen image slider. I'll also create a comment saying that this is the end of the home section. And then let's go ahead and add the div ID for Bootstrap Scrollspy, which is just div ID home. And then we can drop down and close out the div. And before we add the content to the home section, we're going to go ahead and lay out the rest of our div IDs spanning the whole page to link up Bootstrap Scrollspy to our navigation once we add that to the home section in just a few minutes. So I'm going to copy and paste the home section right here, and then I'm going to show you a little shortcut that you may already know. So I'll just add 2 hashtags, and then we actually already have the course section laid out. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this down to the next section underneath the course section, which will be for the portfolio part of the website, as you can see right here. So the shortcut that we're going to use for Sublime Text, I'll put a little image up to show you that. So basically we're just going to select all instances of the 2 hashtags, and then I'm going to change that to portfolio, and then I'm just going to make the div ID lowercase, and then we can do that to the team section beneath the portfolio div ID. So I'll just say team, make it lowercase, and then we can use the shortcut again for the contact section at the very bottom. So I'll go ahead and select it and then just change this to contact. Okay, so now we have all of our div IDs set for Bootstrap Scrollspy, so we can move back up to the top of the website and start building our navbar that has our logo and navigation links inside of it. So move back up to the div ID home, and just beneath that, let's create an invisible comment saying that this is the start of our navigation. Okay, so once we've made our comment here, let's drop down and start off with the HTML5 nav tag, and then we'll say class navbar, and then after that we're going to have a class to set the width at which the navbar expands from the mobile version to the full width version. So we're going to say navbar-expand, and then we're going to use the medium screen width with MD. So MD, as you probably already know if you've built a Bootstrap website before, will be the transition at the 768 pixel mark. So at the bottom of style.css we have a little cheat sheet, and MD, as you can see here, will be for the media query at 768. So now let's add navbar-dark to set our links to a light color to match a dark background. And with that, if we go and refresh, we're not going to see anything yet because we haven't given it a background color. So we'll just use bg-dark for the background color, and there we can see the start of our navbar. And then the last thing that we'll add to our nav class will be the fixed top class, because we're going to keep our navigation bar fixed at the top of the screen. Okay, so let's move on to the logo next, which is going to be wrapped with a link with the anchor tag, and then we're going to give this a class called navbar-brand, which is standard for logos with Bootstrap, and then we'll set our link, and I'm just going to link us to index.html, the same file we're on, and then we can add our image inside of it and then close out the link. So let's go ahead and get the image folder, or the image file rather, and that's going to be inside of the image folder, and then we have nuno.png. So we'll enter the image folder and then nuno.png, and let's go ahead and check it out here in Google Chrome. So there we have our logo. Later on we'll resize it. We'll make it half the size of the original size so it looks good on high resolution phones. And let's move on to the drop down button next. Okay, so for the drop down button, we're just going to use a button tag underneath the logo. So we'll say button, and we're going to give this a class called navbar-toggler because it's the toggle button. And then we're going to give it a type of button. And then we're going to say data-toggle collapse, which with Bootstrap, as we know, the button is going to open and collapse the navigation. And then we're going to give it the same div ID for the data target as the Bootstrap Scrollspy data target. And that's going to be the ID navbar responsive, as we see right here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and paste that in, and then we can drop down and close out the button. And if we go check it out in Google Chrome, we'll see the start of the button, but we don't see the icon inside of it. So let's go ahead and add a span class for that. And the Bootstrap class for the icon is navbar-toggler-icon. And then don't forget to close out your span tag. So once we refresh, there we have our toggle Bootstrap button. And now we can add the actual navigation. So let's drop down underneath the button tag, and I'm going to leave a space, and we'll start a div class off called collapse and navbar-collapse, and then we can give it that ID that we've been referencing with navbar responsive. We'll just need to remove the hashtag because this is the actual ID rather than a reference to it. And then once we close off the div, let's go ahead and start our unordered list, which will contain the list items with the link. So we'll say ul class navbar-nav, and then we'll say ml-auto, meaning margin left auto, which will position our navigation or unordered list off to the right-hand side. If you want it positioned to the left, you would use mr-auto. So once we've added that, let's go ahead and we can close out our unordered list and then add our list items. So we're going to say li class nav-item, and that's the standard list item class for the Bootstrap navigation. And then we have a class nav link, and then we'll say href and then the hashtag home to link us to the home ID. And then we can add the text inside of that. So actually, let's just copy this and paste it a few times because everything's going to be the same except for the references to the different sections of the page and the text for the link. And then we can add the home section at the top along with the text. So I will say that when you're not using Bootstrap Scrollspy, as we link to the first div ID at the top of the page, you'd want to add a class active to the first link with the A class or for whatever page you're on. But here with Bootstrap Scrollspy, it's going to take care of the active class for the different links, so we don't need to add that here. So let's go ahead and fill out the rest of the div IDs followed by the link text. And then we have the last one, which is contact. And I'm going to go ahead and save it and refresh. And let's go over to Google Chrome. And there we have all of our links. So as you can see right now, the contact link is lit up. That's going to be normal with Bootstrap Scrollspy. If there isn't enough content to fill up the browser window, it's going to assume that we're at the last section ID, which is the contact section. Okay, so let's move back over, and I'm going to flex this back up to full screen width, and we can get started on the full screen image slider that appears behind the fixed nav bar. Okay, so let's go back to index.html and drop down underneath the closing nav tag. And I'm going to create a new invisible comment saying this is the start of the image slider. So start image slider. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create the main div ID for the image slider. And we're going to call that div ID carousel example indicators, because the indicators at the bottom of the screen that we just saw will be what controls the different slides. You can also remove that if you want. I'll show you how in just a second. So div ID carousel example indicators, and then we're going to give it two classes, carousel and slide. And then we'll say data-ride carousel. And then with Bootstrap, we can set the interval right here inside of the div for how much time it spends on each individual slide. So right now it's set to 7,000. It's not going to be quite 7 seconds because I have the video sped up a tiny bit, but we're going to set it to 7,000, which would mean 7 seconds. And then we can drop down and close out the div. And I'm also going to create a ending invisible comment saying this is the end of the image slider. Okay, so once we've done that, let's go ahead back up to inside of the div ID, and we're going to add the individual data targets for the carousel indicators, which will be inside of an ordered list. So we'll say OL class carousel-indicators, and then we can drop down and close out the ordered list. And then we'll say li and data-target, and then we'll reference the ID, carousel example indicators that we added at the top here. So we can go ahead and just paste that in, following the hashtag for the ID. And then we'll need to send that to a particular slide. So with Bootstrap Carousel, for the image slider, it always starts with the number 0. So we'll say data slide 2 equals 0. And then for the first slide, we'll add class active because we want it to be active as we see right here. And then once we've done that, we can close out the list item, and we'll need to do this for the 2 other slides. So you can go ahead and just paste that in, and we'll remove the class active, and then we'll change this to 1. And then the third one will be data slide 2 number 2. So if you want to do away with the carousel indicators, you can just delete this whole ordered list, but you'll want to keep the div ID at the top of the image slider section that we've added. So let's move on to the first slide. So as we can see, we don't have any content yet. So we're going to add our first slide inside of a new div class that will be inside of the div ID. And we're going to call this carousel-inner. And then optionally for people with screen readers, you can add role list box. If you want, you can add SR only to the different image slides if you're familiar with that for people with screen readers. Okay, so let's go ahead and close out the div, and I'm going to create a closing comment saying that this is the end of the carousel inner. And inside of that, we can add our first carousel item for the first slide. So let's create a new comment, and I'm just going to say slide 1. And then we'll add our div class, carousel-item. And then similar to what you would do with the nav item for a navigation, we're going to give this an active class. All right, so now we can add the actual background image using style, and to set the image, we'll use the background image style. So we'll say background image URL, and then in parentheses, we'll add the image, which of course is inside of the IMG folder. And then the first image is just going to be computers.png. So img/computers.png. And now that we have the first slide set, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to see it until we add some CSS in style.css to set a height for our carousel item. So let's go ahead and let's add all of the CSS for our website leading up to the image slider in sequence. So the first thing that we're going to add will be our Google font. So I'm just going to do a Google search for Google Fonts Lato, which is the font we'll be using. And then I'll select the font, and then we're going to want it in bold. So I'll hit customize and then select bold down here. And then to embed it, we'll use the import URL style here, which I'll just paste in at the top of the style sheet. And then we'll also need to reference the font family. So I'll copy that. And then let's go back over to style.css to add the font family. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and target the body of the HTML document itself. And then let's set a style called overflow x hidden first to make sure that all of our content stays within the browser window. And then we can set our font family to Lato. And then while we're in the body section, I'm going to also add the color that will appear throughout the website for our font. That's sort of a dark gray shade, a blue grayish shade. So we're going to say color hashtag 505962 for the hex value. And we're not going to see that on the version we've been working on yet because we don't have any text yet. But let's move on to the next bit of our styling, which will be for the navbar at the top of the website. So let's create a new comment here, or really our first comment in style.css. And I'm just going to say navbar to indicate that this is the start of the navbar style. And then let's go ahead and reference the navbar class. And let's set our text to uppercase, and then we're also going to make it bold. So we'll say .navbar and then text transform uppercase, and then we'll say font weight 700 to take advantage of that 700 weight we got from Google Fonts to make it bold. And if we go back and refresh, there we have our uppercase characters for the links as well as the bold font. So let's size it down slightly with font size 0.9 rem. And if you're unfamiliar with rem, 1 rem is the equivalent of 16 pixels, which is the inherent font size with Google Chrome. So this is about 14.5 pixels. And then let's space the characters apart a little bit with letter spacing 0.1 rem. So that looks pretty good until we add the correct color to the links, as well as spacing them out a little bit further, which we'll do with the list item. But let's set the background color to give it its transparency. So we'll say red, green, blue, 0 for all black, and then for alpha, we'll give it a 40% transparency with 0.6, and then we'll say important to override the background color that we gave to our navigation already. So now that that's set, we're not going to see it transparent right now because we don't have any content behind it, but let's move on to the logo next. So we'll want to reference the class that we gave the logo called navbar-brand. So we'll say .navbar-brand, and we'll make the height 32 pixels or 2 rem, which is going to be half the size of the height for the logo, which, as you can see right here, is 64 pixels in height. And this is always good to do for high resolution screens so it doesn't appear pixelated. So we'll say height to rem. And then if we refresh, we'll actually need to target the image. So we'll say Navbar brand IMG to select the image, and there we have our logo resized. So moving on back to the links, let's go ahead and space them out a little bit more by referencing the list items. So we'll say .navbar-nav, which is for the unordered list before we can get to the list items. And then let's give them a padding on the right side of 0.7 rem. Okay, all right, so that spacing looks pretty good. Looks like the original version, there's a little bit of padding on the top, so we'll add that to the links themselves. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to reference the navbar dark, which set the light color to the links, and then navbar-nav and nav-link to override the color of the links. And we'll also add some padding. So we'll say navbar-dark, navbar-nav, and then navbar-link. And then for the color, you can use the hex value FFF for white, or you can just say white. And now we have all of our links white until we hover over them. And let's also change the padding just to match the spacing to the original. So we'll say padding top 0.8 rem, which will move it slightly further away from the top of the browser window. So to target the active class and the hover, let's go ahead and reference the same selector, and we'll say .active to target the color while it's active per Bootstrap Scrollspy section, and then we'll say comma and :hover to target the hover color as well. And we're going to use the shade that you're seeing here in the logo, sort of the turquoise-ish green, whatever you want to call that, and the hex value is 1EBBA3. All right, so let's go back and refresh. And as we learned earlier when we laid out the navigation, the last link is going to stay activated with Bootstrap Scrollspy because we don't have any content yet. So let's move on to the first slide with the image slider next. And let's start it off with the new CSS comment, and we'll just say slider. And then we'll need to set a height to the carousel item that we added for the first slide. So let's go ahead and reference that. So that's going to be .carousel-item. And then we can set the height using a vertical height. So for example, we could say 50 VH, which will make it 50% of the page. But we're going to do a full screen image slider. So we're going to say 100 vertical height, and that's going to fill out the entire browser window. Okay, so once we size it down, as you can see, no matter the width, it's going to stay 100% of the screen, and it's not overflowing outside of it because we set the overflow X hidden to the body. All right, so let's go ahead and move back over to index.html. And for the first slide, we're going to set the caption with the headings and the button that appear on top of it. So we're going to add that inside of the div class that we gave the div class carousel item, which I forgot to close, as you can see here, but that's all right. That wouldn't have made it so we can see the image. We still had to add the height. And we're going to call this section Carousel Caption. So div class carousel-caption. And then all of the text in here will be centered, as you can see. So we're going to use the Bootstrap class text-center, which will take care of that for us. And then we can close out the class. And let's add the first heading, which will be a heading 1, where it says, welcome to Nuno. So I'll just type that in, and later on we'll make it uppercase so you don't have to worry about the characters for now. And then for the heading 3, we'll say animated Bootstrap theme. And then moving on, underneath that we have our button, and we'll use an anchor tag for that. And then we'll add the Bootstrap classes to get the button displaying as we want, with btn and btn-outline-light. And then we're going to use a large button with btn-lg. And then the link for the button is going to send us to the course ID. So we'll say #course. And then we can just add the text for the button, which is get started, and then close out the link. So with Bootstrap buttons, if you want to learn more about how to style different Bootstrap buttons, you can just do a Google search for it. And then under Bootstrap components with the documentation, you'll see buttons on the side. And that's going to show you all the different classes as we move down. So we're going to be using the outline button right here, the light one, which is kind of hard to see, but it looks really good with dark images or backgrounds behind it. So once again, that's just Bootstrap components if you want to learn more about buttons and how to add different Bootstrap elements to your website. So there we have the caption displaying with our headings and the button, but we're not going to style that right now. Let's move on to add the next 2 slides. So we can drop down underneath the div class carousel item, and let's create a new comment saying that this is the second slide. And then once again, we'll want to add carousel item as our div class. And then we'll just take out the active class. And we'll need to change the background image to computers-2.png. So computers-2.png, and then I'm going to close out the div. And if we go back over and refresh, we can wait it out for 7 seconds, or we can, whoops, I forgot the dash here. Or we can use the carousel indicator at the bottom of the screen to see the image. Okay, so let's move on and let's just change the number 2 to number 3 to add our third computer image. And then if we go back and refresh, we have all 3 of our slides appearing, but we don't have the previous and next buttons added yet. So if you don't want those, you can skip over this section, but let's go ahead and create a new comment saying it's the start of our previous and next buttons. All right. So these are going to be inside of an anchor tag. So we'll say a class carousel-control-prev for previous. And then for the link, we'll need to link to the ID that we set for the carousel or image slider overall with carousel example indicators. And then we'll say role equals button. And you can also add SR only here if you want for people with screen readers, but we'll skip over that. And then you can add data slide previous, And then inside of the link, we'll need to add the actual icon. So we'll say span class carousel-control-prev-icon, and then we're going to add area hidden equals true to hide the previous and next buttons from screen readers. Alternatively, you can use SR only previous or next to enable the navigating of the carousel for screen readers, but if there's no content with the images, it doesn't really add any value to the website. Okay, so let's move on to the next button. So we can just paste in the previous content, and then we'll just change prev to next in the 3 instances of it. And then if we go and save it and refresh, there we have the previous and next buttons displaying for us. All right, so now that we have all of our slides laid out, before we move back over to style.css, let's drop down through the website and fill out more of the HTML content. So as we know, we already have the course section laid out for us. We just have to remove the hidden comment here to enable that section. And we already have the CSS laid out for us in style.css. So if we refresh, there we have the Nuno theme Bootstrap course content there with the link to my course as I've promoted at the beginning of the video. And we can drop down to the portfolio section next. So let's move back over to the HTML document, and just underneath the portfolio div ID, let's create a div class, and we're going to start the Jumbotron, which gives us the dark background color that we're seeing separate us from the white background above and beneath the portfolio section. So we're going to say div class Jumbotron, and then we'll also add container-fluid, which will make it so we have 0 margin to the left and right of the viewport or browser window. And then let's drop down and close out the div for our Jumbotron. And I'm also going to create a comment here just saying that this is the end of the Jumbotron because we're going to have a fair amount of content inside of it. And then let's add the first bit of content inside of our Jumbotron, which will be the heading that we're seeing there with the line underneath it. So we're going to use a heading 3 tag to create the heading. And we're going to give it a class. So we'll say h3 class heading, and then we'll add the text, which is portfolio, and then close out your heading 3. And for the line that appears underneath that, we're going to go ahead and let me just refresh. So there we see the portfolio text and the Jumbotron, or at least the start of it there. And as I was saying, for the line underneath the heading, we're just going to create a div class for that we're going to call heading-underline. So we'll say heading underline, and then close out the div. Okay, so now we can drop down to the portfolio that we have here. And since this will be different Bootstrap columns, we'll need to nest that within a Bootstrap row. And then we're also going to give it a class called no-padding, which we'll customize ourselves. That's not a Bootstrap class, to remove the padding in between the columns where we're seeing the portfolio images. So I'm just going to create an ending comment for the row, similar to the Jumbotron, and then we can move on to add the first Bootstrap column for the first image here. So since we have 3 different columns, if we divide 3 into 12, we get 4, and it's going to make the transition at the 576 pixel mark for small screens rather than 768. So that's going to be the SM rather than the MD. So naturally, we'll say column SM and 4. So once we size up past the 576 mark, we'll have 3/4 of the column display. All right, and then I'm just going to give it a div class that we'll call portfolio so we can style these images different from the other images that we add throughout the theme. And then let's add around the image a link that will send us to a different tab with the full image displaying. So we're going to say ahref, and then we'll need to reference that first image that we're linking to, which is inside of the portfolio image here. And that's going to be 1.png. So we'll use img/, and then we'll go into the second folder with portfolio, and then 1.png. And inside of the link, we can go ahead and add the image that's going to display on the website. So we'll say image source, and then we can just reference the same file extension here for the first image. And if we go ahead and refresh, we have the image displaying here, but if we click on it now, it's going to open up in the same tab. So we'll want to add target_blank to the link to send us to a new tab in our web browser. Okay, so you can't really see that a new tab is opening, but I can assure you that it is. So let's go ahead and move on to add the rest of our images. So to save some time, since the images and their extension are the only thing that we need to change, let's go ahead and just copy and paste this 5 different times for the to cover all 6 of the portfolio images. Okay, so once you have it pasted out, we can just go down from number 6 to fill out all of the different file extensions for the different portfolio images. So we have 5.png, or 6 rather, all the way down to 1.png. So if we refresh, we can see that we have all of the images displaying here, but we'll need to add some styling to get it looking like the original. So now that we have our portfolio images, let's add the rest of the content inside the Jumbotron, which with the paragraph text and the button underneath. So we'll add that just above the end of the row, and we're going to use a class that was already used for the course section called narrow to make it so it's not so wide, so it only takes up 75% of the screen. We're also going to learn a trick in the footer section, so you can do that using Bootstrap classes, but for now let's just use that narrow class again, which as you can see right here is set to a width of 75%. So we don't really need it for this section because the paragraph text doesn't span that wide, but in case you add more content, the narrow class will help you out. And then we'll use the text center class to center all of our content. And to create a little space above and beneath it, we'll use col-12, which is a full column width, but it gives us some padding on the top and bottom. And then for the paragraph text, we're going to use a class with Bootstrap that's called pClassLead, and that's what was used in the course section, which makes the paragraph text a little bit larger than the inherent paragraph text. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste that in here, and then we can close out the p tag, and let's add the button underneath that with the anchor tag, and then class btn and btn-secondary, and then that's going to be a medium-sized button, which was styled in the course section. So we'll say btn-md, and then the link for that, say href, and I'm just going to copy the link from here, which is to my course, of course, and then we'll say target_blank to send us to a new window or tab. And then for the text, I'm just going to say Bootstrap course and close out the link. Okay, so let's go and refresh. And there we have the paragraph text and the button appearing underneath the portfolio images. So let's drop down and let's just finish off the HTML content before we go over to style.css, and let's move on to the team section of the website, where we'll have a heading that's very similar, almost exactly the same as the portfolio heading, except for we'll just change the text to reflect the team part of the website. So we'll say h3 class heading team, and then we can drop down and we'll add a new Bootstrap row, which will nest the columns inside of it here. So we'll say div class row, and we're also going to add some additional padding. You can see they're kind of spaced out a good bit here. So we'll just add a class that we'll customize ourselves called padding. And there is an option to add Bootstrap padding classes, but it gets kind of messy. I just like to use a standard like padding class that we just style once and you can reference throughout a theme. Okay, so now that we've closed out the row, let's go ahead and add the first section. So this is going to transition at the 768 medium screen mark. So we're going to use div class col-md for medium, and then 6, which goes into 12 twice because we have the 2 columns there. And then once we're inside of that, we're going to use a div class with Bootstrap called card. And then all the text is centered inside of the card, so we'll say text center, and then we can drop down and close out the div. So Bootstrap cards, if we want to reference the components again, is a cool feature that you can check out, and you can customize the placement of the image and the content with the cards. As you can see right here, we're going to do an image on top and then the body section at the bottom in this case, as we see. So let's go ahead and add the image with image class card-image-top. And then for the image source, if we reference the image folder, that's going to be inside of the team folder. So we'll have img/team/team.1 or team1 rather .png. All right. So then moving on, underneath the image, we have the body section of the card. So we'll say div class card-body, and then we can drop down and close out the div, and inside of that we'll have a heading right here where it has the name. So we're going to use a heading 4. So H4, and I'll just write in Jessica Miller. And then we have the quote with the paragraph text underneath. So we're just going to have that with a regular paragraph tag, or you can use the cite tag to make it italics with the quote. And there we have the first of our 2 cards filled out. So before we move on to the next card, let's take care of centering the heading 3s that we added, as you can see right here with the team text and then the portfolio text. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this with a div class col-12 to add some padding around it, and then we'll also just say text center, and then I'm just going to indent these and close out the col-12 div class. So now let's also apply this to the portfolio heading 3 up in the Jumbotron. So I'll just paste that in, indent, and then close out the col-12 div. Okay, so that looks better with it centered and with a little bit of extra padding around it. So now let's add the second of our cards. So similar to the portfolio section, we don't really need to change much. So let's go ahead and just paste in the first card, and we'll just change that to team 2, and then we'll change the heading 4 to Charles Davis, and then we can just leave the paragraph text the same. Okay, so there we have our second card, and as we know, once we get to the style section, we'll take care of the padding in between them. But let's move down to the footer section of the website next. So we'll go down to the contact ID, and for the footer section, we're just going to start it off with a good old-fashioned HTML5 footer tag, which we'll later apply the background color to. And then inside of that, to center our content, and then have it change to full width once we get down to 768 pixels, we're going to start a div class row, and we're going to say justify-content.-center, so we can just use a single Bootstrap column that doesn't take up the full width and have Bootstrap center it for us inside of the footer. So this is something that you could do instead of adding that narrow class that we used earlier. And then let's close out the row, and then we'll just need to add the column inside of it. So for this column, we're going to have it take up almost half of the page, a little bit less. So out of 12 columns, we'll use up 5 and have it change at the medium screen width to the full column layout. Okay, so now let's add the image, which will be the same file extension that we use for the logo, which is nuno.png. And then we can add the paragraph text underneath it. So I'm just going to paste this in. All right. And then underneath the paragraph text, we have the text that says contact info. And as you can see, that's bold. So we'll just use the strong tag to make it bold. And then underneath that, for the phone number and the email address, we'll put that into a paragraph tag. And then we can just keep it inside of the same paragraph tag and create a line break with the BR tag. And then we have the social media links at the bottom of the page. So let's go ahead and add those, and we'll also center the text here. So there we go. All right, and then moving on to the social media icons that appear towards the bottom of the footer section, we're going to wrap those with a link. So we'll start those off with ahref, and then let's link it to a different tab with target_blank. And then for the icon with font awesome, that's going to be iClass, and they're all going to start with FAB, FA dash, and then we can close out the I tag for the icon as well as the link. And since we have 3 different social icons, let's go ahead and just paste this out 3 times, and then we can add the link and the class for each icon. So you can link to your own social media pages. I'm just going to copy and paste my link here. Just make sure that when you add your links, you have the full address with the HTTP or HTTPS for SSL. Okay, so once we have our links in there, each one of the social icons from Font Awesome, as I said, will start with FAB, FA dash, which you can get from right here if you want to search for your own icons. And for Facebook, we'll just say FAB, FA dash Facebook, and then dash square, because there are multiple versions of Facebook icons as well as Twitter, which we'll use the square version of for this as well. And then with Instagram, I don't think that they've come out with a square version yet. So we just have the one icon for Instagram, which we'll use, which is just FA-Instagram. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at it. And there we have our icons giving us the blue link color, and we'll go ahead and resize those in just a moment. But let's take care of the socket with the line and the copyright text that appears at the bottom of the footer section. So we'll just use a heading or a horizontal row class for that. and we'll give it a class called socket, and then we'll just use ampersand copy semicolon for the copyright icon. And if we go back to Chrome and we refresh, it's going to be kind of not aligned properly, but once we add a width to the HR class, it will realign itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started, or get back to our style sheet. And the first thing that we're going to style is something called the offset. So when we click on the links sending us to different sections of the page, as you can see, the navigation is sitting on top of the content. So if you remember from the course section, that already has the class added to it here that was included for us with the starter files where it says class offset. So let's go ahead and just add that to the different div IDs for the sections of the website. And we'll add those to all of them except for the home section where we don't need one because we're already at the very top of the website. So we'll say class offset. And basically with offset, we're going to create some space at the top of the sections. So the link to the ID sends us to the bottom of the navbar. So we'll say offset colon before, and then to account for that space right there, we're going to give it a height first. So we'll give it a height of 4 rem, and then we'll say margin top negative 4 rem to kind of erase the space so we don't have blank white space. And then we'll make a blank content style here, and then we'll say display block, which will actually allow it to appear. Okay, so now it's accounting for that space, which is about 64 pixels at the top, and there's actually a tiny bit more space to account for there, so we did a little bit too much. So let's try 3.9 rem to try to match it up exactly to the start of the ID. So that's closer, but there's still a sliver of space, so we can change that to 3.8 rem, and you can mess around with this depending on your customizations to the navbar, for example. So that looks good. And all right, so let's go back to styling the website from the image slider where we added the caption content to the slider. So above the course section comment, let's drop down underneath the carousel item style, and we'll want to reference the class that we gave to the caption. So that was a custom class that we added just called carousel caption. This isn't a Bootstrap class, but we'll go ahead and reference it here. And as we know from the HTML that we added, with the carousel caption, right now it's positioned at the bottom of the screen, but to get it centered on top of the image slider, what we're going to do is we're going to give it absolute positioning so we can position it wherever we want. So as we see right here, it's at the bottom, and let's just say position absolute, and then we can give it a position from the top of the website, and we're going to say 38%, which will center it on the page for us. So there we have it centered. And then all of our text for the caption will be uppercase. So let's go ahead and say text transform uppercase. And then let's drop down to start styling the headings. So the first heading is going to be the heading 1 where it says welcome to Nuno. So that's going to be inside of the carousel caption class. So we'll say dot carousel dash caption h1. And then let's give this a font size of 3.8 rem, which will be about 60 pixels or so. And then we'll say font weight 700 to make it bold. And then let's also space the letters out a little bit with letter spacing 0.3 rem. And it's dropped down to the next line. So we'll need to give it a width to the carousel caption class. Let's give it a width of 100%. And once we do that, because we're using absolute positioning, we'll need to position it left and right. So let's say right 0, and then we'll also need to say left 0, so it takes up the full 100% width. Okay, so there we go. All right, so now, as I said, let's move down to the heading 3. Actually, I think we need to add to the heading 1 some text shadow. Let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll move on to the heading 3. So drop down underneath the letter spacing, and we'll say text shadow, 0.1 rem horizontal, 0.1 rem vertical, and then we'll give it a blur radius of 0.8 rem, and we'll just give it a color of black. And then let's also add padding bottom 1 rem to separate the heading 1 from the heading 3. Okay. So let's go and refresh it. And there we see it lining up, except for we'll need to resize the heading 3, and then we'll move on to the button. So we'll say carousel caption H3, and then let's change the font size for this as well to 32 pixels or 2 rem. And then for the text shadow, let's also use 1 rem for the horizontal and vertical, and then we'll just use, or 0.1 rem rather, and then we'll use 0.5 rem for the blur radius, and then we'll also use black to make the white text stand out the most with the dark background. And then for the padding, let's say padding bottom 1.6 rem to separate it from the button underneath it. Okay, so that looks good except for obviously the button styling. So if we go back over to the HTML, the button that we're using for this will be the large button. And since that's the only large button that we're using for the website, we'll just reference that class itself. And we're going to say border width medium to make the border thicker. And then we'll say border radius to get rid of the rounded corners. And then the finished version has a bit larger font to it. So let's increase the font to 1.1 rem. So we'll say font size 1.1 rem. And let's save it. And now if we toggle back and forth, we can't tell the difference. Okay, so that does it for the image slider section of the website. Later on, we'll get to the media query to resize the carousel caption once we go down to 768. But for now, let's drop down to, well, we already have the course section filled out for us, so let's drop down to the portfolio section. Okay, so let's move over to, or drop down underneath the course section, and you can add a portfolio comment if you want, but we'll want to reference the Jumbotron first. So inherently the Jumbotron has a little bit of border radius. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but if you look closely, it's there. So we're going to say border radius 0 to keep with sort of the boxy feel of the website, which will remove the rounded corners. And then let's reduce the padding on the bottom and top. So we're going to say padding 3 rem top, 0 left right, and 2 rem bottom. And now it's reduced a little bit, so that's going to look a little cleaner. I think that they add a little too much padding to the Jumbotron inherently. Okay, so that looks good, and now let's go and let's style the heading 3 that first appears inside of the Jumbotron, where it says portfolio. And if you remember from the HTML, that was a heading 3 class. that we gave the class heading, and then we have the heading underline class just underneath it. So we'll say h3.heading, and let's increase the font size to 1.9 rem, and then we'll make it bold with font weight 700, and uppercase with text transform uppercase. And if we refresh, there we have it looking like the original. Okay, so we'll need to add some padding to separate it from the line underneath it. We'll say padding bottom 1.9 rem. And then we can style the heading underline class. So we'll say heading underline, and let's set a width for it. So that's going to be 3 rem in width, and then once we set the width, we'll need to give it a height. So we'll give it a height of 0.2 rem. And then the background color, we're going to use the same color that we gave the navigation with the hex value 1 EBBA3, which is that green shade. So there we have it, but it's off to the left. So to center it, let's go ahead and add margin 0 auto, and then we'll also just add a little bit of margin underneath it to separate the portfolio images with 2 rem. So margin 0 top, auto left right, and 2 rem bottom. Okay, so now that that's set, let's go ahead and style the portfolio images next. Okay, so if you remember from the portfolio section in the HTML, as I make a portfolio comment here, we used a class to reference the portfolio images specifically that's just called portfolio. So to get to the images, we'll reference that class first, and then image, which is inside of it. So we'll say dot portfolio image, and then we'll give it a max width of 100% to keep it within the column. And then to get rid of the space in between the columns, we'll reference the class that we added to the row, which is no padding. So to get to that, we'll reference the class and then no padding, or the row rather, and then no padding, and then the column class. So we want to select all instances of the column. So we'll say row no padding, and then in brackets col asterisk equals col dash, because all of the columns start with col dash, and then we can just say padding 0. Okay, so let's refresh, and there we have the portfolio section without any padding in between the images. So as we can see, when we hover over the images, there's a transition effect. Let's go ahead and add that next. So we'll add that to the image, but first we'll need to add the hover effect. So that's going to actually scale it. And then to make it a smooth transition, we'll add that to the image. So we'll say transform scale 1.1, and then we'll change the cursor from the pointer to the zoom in cursor. And now if we go and look at it, it's going to scale for us, but it's not going to be a smooth transition. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the portfolio image reference where we added max width 100%, and let's add transition transform 0.5 seconds ease. So that should give us a nice smooth transition while it's scaling. So that looks good, except for it's overflowing outside of the portfolio. So let's reference the portfolio class by itself, and we're just going to say overflow hidden. Okay, so that looks good. So that's everything for the portfolio section. But let's move down to the team section here. And there's a little bit of space that we'll get rid of in between the different cards. So let's go ahead and just reference the card class with .card, and we'll say margin 2 rem to separate them. And there we have it. Okay, so that looks good. But I'm noticing some spacing differences. As you can see, the start of the team section is a little off using the navigation. So let's add margin bottom 0 to the Jumbotron. Okay, so now if we select it, there we have it matching up to the bottom of the Jumbotron when we select the team link. So now we can move on to the last section of the website, which is the contact section or the footer. So let's go back to the style.css, and I'm going to create a comment here saying this is the start of the contact CSS. And then if you remember, inside of that we have the footer tag. So let's go ahead and reference that, and then we can add the background color. So we'll say footer, open and close your swirly brackets, and then we'll say background color, and the hex value for this is going to be 40474E. And I think this is a darker shade than a similar color, but a darker shade of the color of the text that we added to the body of the website, or the body tag. So there we have the background color, and as you can see, the text in it is too dark, so we'll change that to white with color white. And then we'll need to add some padding to get some spacing to the top and bottom of it. So let's add padding 2 rem on the top and 3 rem on the bottom. So 2 rem top, 0 left, right, and 3 rem bottom. Okay, so now the spacing looks better. And then let's also just add a little bit of margin to the top of the footer to separate it from the cards with margin top 1 rem. Okay, so that looks good. All right, so now let's move on to the logo. And we're going to make this bigger than the logo in the Navbar. So we'll get to that with referencing the footer and then image. And then let's change the height to 3 rem instead of 2 rem, which is what we gave it in the Navbar. And then let's also just add some margin to it to separate it from the content around it. So we'll say margin 1.5 rem top bottom and 0 left right. All right, so that looks good. And moving on, the next thing that we'll do is let's make all the links in the footer white. So on cell phones, you might see that the phone number and the email address appear as links and appear blue in color. So we'll change that to white, and then this will also affect the social media icons, making them white as well. Okay, so that looks good. And then with the social icons, let's go ahead and resize them, and then we'll add the hover effect for when we hover over them to get the same green shade that we've been using throughout the website. So we'll say footer and then svg.svg-inline-fa. It's kind of an odd class, but if you select the icon, that's the class that you'll come up with. And then we'll say font size 1.6 rem. And that looks better, except for let's space them out a little bit. So we'll space them out a little bit vertically and to the right. So we'll say margin 1.2 rem top and then 0.5 rem right, and then we'll just say 0, 0 for bottom and left. Okay, so that looks good. And then we have the hover color to add. So let's go ahead and use the same selector here, and then we can just add the hover effect. So :hover, and let's add the color hex value 1 EBBA3 that we've been using. Okay. All right, so there we have the hover effect to the social icons. And then lastly, for the full width version of the website, let's go ahead and style the socket at the bottom, is what they call the little copyright section on websites. So let's style the HR class socket with hr.socket, and then we're just going to say border top 0.2 rem, and then we're going to give it a gray shade, so we'll say solid, and then the hex value 666, which is solid gray, but we're going to add B71, and then let's give it a width of 100%. So it's going to be an off gray shade. And now with the 100% width, as you can see, it's realigned the positioning of the footer. So you can also change that to the green. It looks kind of loud at the bottom of the website though, so let's just keep it to that gray shade. Alright, so that does it for all of the CSS for the full width version of the website, but as you can see when we size it down, everything looks pretty good until we get towards the top of the website, where we'll find that we have some headings to correct. So this heading looks kind of big in the course section, and then obviously the heading for the carousel caption. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a new comment, and we're just going to say that this is the start of the media query. So we'll say media queries and then close out the comment. And then we're going to target the 768 pixel mark, but because Bootstrap starts at mobile first with min width, as you can see right here, we're going to have to use max width 767 to match the min width 768 mark. So since we designed for a full width website rather than mobile first, we'll use max width instead of min width. Okay, so let's go ahead and target the headings inside of the carousel caption. So since we're just going to override this style anyways, we can just go ahead and select it from the full width and then paste it in here. And I'm just going to delete some of this because we're not going to style everything. We just need to reference the styles that we're going to override. So we'll do away with the text shadow, with the font weight, and we can do away with the border width and the border radius for the button. And then in addition to that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to indent some of this so it looks prettier. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's resize the font for the heading 1. So let's drop that down to 2.3 rem from 3.8, and then we'll just cut this in half with 0.15 for the letter spacing and 0.5 rem for the padding on the bottom. Okay, so that looks good. So let's move on to the heading 3, and let's change that to 1.2 rem and 1.2 rem. And then for the button, let's just make that 1 rem to make it slightly smaller. Alright, so now if we toggle back and forth, you can't really tell the difference until we get down to the heading in the course section that we see right here where it says Nuno theme Bootstrap course. So we'll want to reference the narrow class because the heading 1 is inside of that, but we didn't actually style that earlier. And it didn't come styled inherently, so let's go ahead and just target that using the narrow class and the heading 1. So we'll say .narrow and h1, and then we'll just say font size 1.5 rem. All right. Okay, so that's made it smaller, but the paragraph text underneath it looks kind of big now, so you can style that if you want. If you remember, that's just the lead class inside of the paragraph tag. So we'll just say p-lead font size 0.9 rem, and that's a little small. Let's just change it to 1 rem. Okay, so that looks good. Alright, so you can mess around with the sizing and the styling and customize this however you want for your own use, but that does it for the complete tutorial. I want to thank you for watching. Please remember to check out my Bootstrap course in the video description, like this video, subscribe, turn on your notifications, and then I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.